Iraq has been the most deadly conflict for journalists ever. Foreign reporters are targeted for kidnap and murder. 230 news professionals have been killed here since the American invasion. So dangerous has it become that international reporters have adopted new ways of working. But do the techniques imposed on them by the threats to their lives prevent them finding out the truth?
In an ideal world, I'd have come out here and I'd be working on my own as a journalist, producing stories for the Western news media. That's the old model, and that model has been scrapped. It's as outdated as trench warfare.
Neil was frustrated with his desk job at the BBC's newsroom in London. He wanted to get closer to the story. This Kurdish-controlled area is a relatively safe part of Iraq where Neil can work freely on the street. Months after an inconclusive election, there is still no government, and Neil has asked his most experienced Iraqi colleagues to find out whether paramilitary leaders plan to resume the violence.
Iraq is the deadliest country for journalists in the world, for Iraqis, let alone foreign journalists. Iraq is a different planet for journalists. It's all about working with the possible in Iraq.
The only fears that I have at the moment is the militias, or is the spies to the militias who can chase us and who can arrest us or shoot us dead.
At the height of the conflict in Iraq, international journalists were mostly confined to their offices and depended heavily on local reporters. As an editor at a news NGO, a non-governmental organisation known as the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, Neil uses the same model.
One of the biggest questions we're facing at the moment is that of violence. Whether Iraq is going to become more violent or less violent over the next few weeks. We're looking at a story that will speak to men from both sides of the sectarian divide, Al-Qaeda and the Mahdi army, and get a sense of whether they are preparing for war.
Neil's task is to train local reporters in fact-based journalism, so he relies on local journalists to report for IWPR's website.
The first person I'm going to discuss the story with is my colleague Mohammed. We're going to discuss which reporters would be most suitable for covering it. In a sense, this stage is like it's the commissioning stage, but it's also the casting stage. Let's use Khalid in Baghdad for the official angle. Sadr City.
Khalid as well.
What are the limits of Uthman's coverage area?
Working with Iraqi journalists is a bit complicated because they depend to a great extent on personal contacts in their own cities, in their respective cities. Like in Baghdad, if you want to do a story about a former insurgent, you have to be connected, tribally connected. A family contact would facilitate this interview. Not because you are a journalist, you can do it.
Let's work on the questions. Once we've worked out exactly what we want from the story, we produce a very, very detailed list of questions, which the reporter has to follow in order to produce the story. Effectively, it's a way of holding the reporter by the hand. We try and give them the means to tell the story themselves. We show them what kind of questions you need to ask in order to produce a thorough story.
Neil's colleagues set out to work on the story. Uthman al-Mukhtar is a reporter who works in Fallujah, a former centre for the insurgency where journalists need to work carefully. Khalid al-Ansari is in Adhamiyah, a Sunni district of Baghdad, which was also, until 2008, a base for Al-Qaeda. Last time he was here with a camera, Khalid was threatened by paramilitary fighters.
You talk to the reporter about the story idea, and then you have to prove that this is not going to ruin somebody's life. A source, whether in the government or in the private sector or a citizen, a member of the public, you have to convince them that this is not going to be a security threat to their lives, including the reporter.
It's too dangerous for us to film, so we've commissioned local camera operators to follow the reporters as they work. But reporters aren't safe anywhere. A student blogger who wrote about corruption in the Kurdish government has been abducted and murdered. His classmates come out onto the street to protest his death.
Most of them say they want justice, which means effectively that they want the killers to be punished. But there are deeper issues here beyond the crime and the punishment. The deeper issue is one of press freedom. Some minutes ago, the demonstrators were shouting "Azadi, Azadi," which means freedom, freedom. The protest organizers have been urging people to stop shouting that. It's a very emotive cry. It's one that was used during the Kurds' struggle against Saddam Hussein. To hear that cry now against what is now a semi-autonomous Kurdish government suggests to the protesters that they have autonomy but not freedom.
We demand the authorities to form an investigation committee to follow up this case so as to expose the criminals involved in.
A member of the Kurdish parliament says the protesters' anger is misdirected.
These kind of the crimes that may be a very negative point and very negative result to the security case.
So you're telling me that this happened because it's a security failure, it's a lapse in security.
Yeah.
But if you speak to some of the protesters, they will say that it's the opposite. It's the fact that the security forces are operating outside the rule of law. They're saying that this journalism student was killed by someone involved in the security forces. Broadly speaking, the threats to journalists here are not the same as the threats to journalists in Iraq. In Iraq proper, in the Arab parts of Iraq, journalists are frequently killed. The difference is that the Kurdish region has a very powerful state, and this is part of the reason why it's been able to ensure the stability, and it's been able to ensure an environment where foreigners such as I can work relatively freely. The flip side of that coin is that in order to ensure that security, they've cultivated an extremely powerful security apparatus. And that security apparatus, every so often, turns on its own citizens. Whether that's what's happened here in the killing of this journalist, we don't know. Rights groups say the press freedom situation in Kurdistan has been deteriorating steadily, with attacks on journalists, with censorship, with threats, with intimidation. What this suggests is that the rules of the game for journalists working in this region have changed.
In Adhamir, Khalid has set up an interview with a leader from the Sahwa militia. The Americans paid these former insurgents to fight Al-Qaeda. They call them the Awakening. The man agrees to film a discreet interview on waste ground off the main street, but the mood is still tense.
منو؟
ابو الجراج انهزم خاف.
ابو الجراج انهزم؟
إيه.
انهزم ليش؟
يخوف من تصويره.
انهزم لانه شاف كاميرا وشافك
إيه.
واحد يحكي
إيه.
بالانجليزي
إيه.
وقال لك هذا يعني اكو فد خطر علينا.
الجيش يجي هاي.
When I met this leader, the Sahwa leader, he gave me a kind of hint that the situation is not comfortable here. We've been told by the Sahwa leader that there was a guy was kind of watching us or kind of a spy, because he said that there are some spies for the Iraqi army in this area. So what I'm going to do is just to finish the interview with this shop owner, and if I feel more comfortable, I will continue. If not, I will move to another neighborhood or to another part of Adhamir.
Okay, Khalid, keep me updated and just get out of there if you feel threatened. Okay, don't stay a moment too long.
I will keep you posted, my friend. I will keep you posted.
Okay, speak in an hour.
Speak to you in an hour.
Khalid decides to change location. If he conducts his next interview in a shop, it will be more discreet than filming on the street.
وإذا صاروا يعني هالحكومة هاي تجددت مرت اللخ يصير نحو الأسوأ.
شلون يعني نحو الأسوأ؟
يعني الشارع العراقي بعد ما تكون تتجول من منطقة لمنطقة. زين، تصير طائفية.
Khalid's work does not end in Adhamir. Neil wants him to go an extra mile for the story. He asks him to find out about tensions in Abu Ghraib, a dangerous Baghdad suburb that is notorious for its prison.
I will contact a friend of mine to report for me, because that area I cannot risk my life. It's not a good place for me to be there, but it will be kind of hand over the kind of work to a friend of mine who's living there and who can report for the story I'm working on.
As a rule, journalists working with IWPR are forbidden from subcontracting their stories. Only in the most exceptional cases will this method be used. Typically, if it is too dangerous for a reporter working alone to gather all the information. In that case, a key quote or detail may come from a person who simply has the best access and faces the least risk. But outsourcing raises doubts about who stands for the truth of the story.
One of the biggest problems is that you lose control. You lose control over the veracity of the story, over the accuracy, because you don't know if someone has really seen what they say they have seen, if someone has really heard what they say they have heard.
While IWPR's editors place tight curbs on subcontracting, the practice is widespread in the Iraqi media. Where no checks are enforced, the subcontracting model can end up being repeated several times. Neil describes a hypothetical situation where a reporter may be tempted to rely on a string of contacts for information that he cannot risk gathering himself.
What he will do is call up his friend, who has a friend, who will go out into the street. The street could be the one outside his house, so he's safe walking out there. He will gather the quotes from people who are his friends, from his family, perhaps his extended family. That information would then be communicated back by phone to the reporter whom I commissioned.
Subcontracting is not without risk, but this method is sometimes the best way to get information from dangerous areas, provided all the sources can be trusted.
السلام عليكم دكتور شلونك عيني؟ شلون صحتك إن شاء الله بخير الله يسلمك هلا دكتور.
Neil and his colleagues take several precautions to ensure the information they receive is accurate. They use this method rarely and only with the most reliable reporters, in a manner that has been agreed beforehand. Often, Neil will assign the same task to more than one reporter, so that the material can be cross-checked.
The information for the story almost becomes like this thing that's transmitted through a circuit of relatively static reporters. It's like those ways you see soldiers hauling sandbags when they're building a wall. They stand in a line and the sandbag gets passed from soldier to soldier to soldier. It's the most efficient way of communicating something. We have to find a mechanism of making sure it's true, making sure it's accurate. And we can never, ever, ever be 100% sure. We make it very clear to them that they have to be transparent. And not only do you need to be transparent in what you report, but you also need to be transparent in the way you went about your reporting. It's extremely important. And if we mistrust you on the way you went about your reporting, then it's no use if your report itself was honest or fair or balanced.
Uthman in Fallujah is an award-winning reporter who works for both the domestic and international press. Occasionally, he and his colleagues rely on each other to gather quotes. This may be because of security concerns or because checkpoints make it hard to travel to certain areas. He calls their network a circle of trust.
شبكة اتصالات ويا مراسلين، المراسلين دول صحفيين أيضا وبعضهم أشخاص ثقات جربناهم بالسابق وتأكدنا من صدقية معلوماتهم اللي احنا نتعامل وياها أو أنا شخصيا أتعامل وياهم واللي يعرفون أسلوب شغله ويعرفوني شنو أريد وشنو نوع الأسئلة اللي أحب دائما أطرحها وشنو لون الشخص اللي احنا نلتقي به.
Uthman recently had to outsource part of a story to a trusted colleague from another town. He was investigating the killing of 2 Al-Qaeda leaders, and he was warned he would be killed if he visited the area himself.
اضطريت أكلف أحد الأشخاص الثقات واللي هو مصدر معتمد عندي من أهالي المنطقة واللي له حرية يتجول أكثر واللي معروف داخل منطقة بحيرة الثرثار حتى آخذ منه تفاصيل عن عملية المداهمة أو العملية اللي أدت إلى مقتل زعيمي تنظيم القاعدة. هاي الأمور يعني بشيء أكيد يعني إحنا لازم نعترف بأنه أنا ما راح أقدر أجيب الصورة المكانية والزمانية للقصة عن طريق المصدر مثل ما لو أنا رحت
With his reporters safely back at base, Neil files his story on the men of violence.
In terms of serving the story, we're serving the story in a way that I probably wouldn't be able to serve the story if I was working on my own. Having commissioned people like Khalid to report from Baghdad is very different, and in some respects, in many respects, it's a stronger story. Just as the insurgency has evolved, just as warfare has evolved rapidly, very, very fast, in the same way reporting has evolved very, very fast, and it's changed into a completely new beast. And we're still learning what this beast is. We're still trying to classify it when we come here from the West and look at it. There's no existing genus that it fits into. It's a strange animal.